Yeah. Yeah. So since the recording has begun formally, good evening to all of you, and let me welcome you to this course. Welcome, and this is the course. We're going to essentially be discussing, participating with each other on this TechWeb course, exciting opportunities in AI and ML for engineering applications. And what I'm going to do over the next 1.5 hours is basically an overview of exciting opportunities. I've used the word process data analytics here primarily to convey that this is the first step towards going to AI and ML. Data analytics is basically a lot of analysis, as the word suggests, a lot of data. But when you talk of data, it has all these very peculiar aspects, challenging aspects like volume, veracity, velocity. Depending on the applications, you have vagaries of the data, and how do you look at this data as a first step to be able to derive some information, knowledge about the system. And going further, this integrates into machine learning or then the use of artificial intelligence tools. All of this, when put together, actually unveils a huge amount of opportunities, which, at various stages, if you talk about the discovery stage of molecules, if you go towards the advanced stage of translation of discovery into process development to operation, and subsequent to the operation in terms of performance analysis, performance benchmarks, fault detection and diagnosis, eventually leading to decision support systems, advanced decision support systems, and the like. If you look at all of this entire spectrum of activities that essentially make our processes more efficient, this is the first step. And if you talk of process data analytics, this is the first step. And understanding this helps us to build further into those opportunities. And by the end of the course, hopefully through our interactions, we will see the extent of value that that is present in AI and ML, and how we can leverage those to conduct our practices better. So I go to the second slide here, which essentially is, it's well known, but it's good to reiterate. Basically, whatever we do, be it in mechanical engineering, be it in chemical engineering, be it in electrical space, energy space, you're essentially involved in manufacturing, maybe manufacturing of chips, manufacturing of sensors, manufacturing of processes, development of processes. So it's a good idea to just step back and see what makes our processes efficient. Okay, what do you think the process that is efficient? You need to step back and go right up to the design stage, and we say that there is a fair bit of emphasis on a robust process design. Now, the word robust has several connotations, but essentially the connotation that we speak about here is the design that can handle uncertainties, that can handle variations of all kinds. It can be in faster time scale, slower time scale, uh, at the input, at the output, at several different points in the value chain. Okay. So what you need to do is be able to come up with first a robust process design that can handle uncertainty and variations. How do you do this? You base it on the best knowledge available from the physics. So we call it as systemic knowledge. So for example, in chemical engineering, you can write mass and energy balances, both static as well as dynamic. In mechanical engineering, you might write the kinematic principles, let's say, associated with a robot. In aerospace, you can write the 6 degrees of freedom, first principles, equations, and the like. Based on that, you come up with a robust process design. Now, this robust process design is based on some kind of an uncertainty that you think is present at different stages of the operation of the plant. Right? So you characterize this uncertainty in an approximate manner, conservatively, develop a system, design a system that can handle this uncertainty or variations. Okay? Now, there is no guarantee that once you develop this, that this process will work through and through over the entire life cycle. Right? So now what you want to do is your principles, the first principles or your physics based on the kinematics, based on the 6 degree of freedom equations or your mass and energy balances, these would be incomplete. So it's not completely accurate. So can we now switch into, once we have designed the process, switch into a mode where we continuously learn from what? Learn from a second source of information, which is the measurements. So you have the design, which is based on physics. Now you have a second source of information that is present in your measurements. The design is done once. Measurements continue to give you more and more information as you try probing the system. And so there is this opportunity of continuous learning, basically leveraging information from measurements. Okay? Measurements can be available at different points, lab scale. In fact, even prior to lab scale, experiments, lab scale, pilot scale, full scale. Okay, can we leverage these measurements, which is what data analytics is all about, and that would hopefully result in improved manufacturing in a continuous learning. So, good manufacturing practices is yes, design the process robustly based on whatever available information from the physics you have, but do continuous learning. You have a second source of information, do continuous learning and enhance your understanding so that you can improve your practices. Okay? So essentially what process data analytics helps you to do is exploit the data content towards improved from where? Improved from the current point. How much improvement? We'll talk about it in a minute. Right? There is a benchmark. How do you establish that benchmark? That's also an open question. But at least certainly it's improvement from now towards that benchmark. Okay. You also want your processes to be safe. You also want them to be productive in terms of whatever productivity measures you have, specific energy, high efficiency, specific energy, whatever. You want to be able to look at those and drive the process towards improvement. Okay. So now what is process data analytics? It is basically the discovery and purposeful utilization. So purposeful utilization meaning you are directing it towards either understanding of the process, establishing benchmarks, or purposeful utilization, exploitation of meaningful patterns and information in the data. Okay, that is what analytics is all about. Okay, now for those of us who are in the process control domain or the manufacturing control domain, any place where feedback control is applied, this is already commonplace because we use measurements, we use models. We use models to design our controllers. We use measurements to close the loop. So what is it that is new? We have already been doing this. We have already been using measurements. We are using feedback control. We are correcting our processes. It's a process control. We are doing this anyway. So what is it that we are talking about new? We are exploiting data much, much more effectively. And so the new generation approaches here in data analytics, it focuses with a purposeful intent of converting data, and I'll tell you what this means, information. Information gets converted or distilled, if I may use that word. Information gets distilled to knowledge. Knowledge gets distilled to wisdom. We'll understand each of these terms as we go ahead. Okay? By the way, please feel free to, raise your hands or, just interrupt me in case you have any questions. Okay? For those of you who joined late, I've been seeing people joining after we began at 5:45. Firstly, I would like to offer my most sincere apologies. There was some difficulty in our Microsoft Teams, which has been configured for within IIT. And when we sent that link outside, we were not aware. In fact, we are still not aware what correction is needed. It needs some resolution to be able to be applicable to participants from outside. We will do that going forward. So our sincere apologies. We started at 5:45 and we'll go up to 7:15 as part of the as far as this first lecture is concerned, and then we'll take a decision on the second lecture. So this is what I had to say. Path from data to wisdom. As I said, we have data. What is data now? Data is essentially discrete elements that streams in. Okay. When you take this data, you essentially get a raw pulse of the system, which is what we have been doing in process control. This raw pulse, if it is above the target, you take corrective action. If it is below the target, steam flow increase or decrease, bring the temperature back to on the target. This is based on raw pulse. But we want to do more in this area of artificial intelligence. We want to do much more. Okay. So what we could do, the first thing is you can just aggregate the data. We essentially get signatures and trends. How does this help? This helps, for example, if my performance benchmark, when my process is not at the benchmark, it is gradually approaching the benchmark, it is an increasing trend. Or it could be drifting away from the benchmark, it's a decreasing trend. I can capture these trends. If I have an incipient fault, which means the fault has just begun, but it is not showing up actually in one of those alarm limits, this is a signature that I can try to define and capture from my data and take corrective action before it actually hits the alarm limits. Right? I would like to do that. Right? Signatures and trends are useful. How we generate them? We aggregate data, right? We aggregate data and we generate signatures and trends. Now, this is what we classify under information. Now, when we organize this information, what do you mean by organizing this information? An increasing trend and a decreasing trend. What does this tell me? Okay. Or two increasing trends, what does it tell me? So can I organize this information in some way to derive more knowledge about the system, right? If I do that, if I organize the information to get knowledge, I establish best operation templates. And I'll give you an example here. Yeah. When my productivity is at the average level, a standard process manufacturer would be happy. If it goes towards the improved best seen level, then he is even happier, he or she. But if it is below the best, the average, then there is a cause for concern. So what's the best operation template? A best operation template is trying to push the average behavior as close to the best known behavior as possible. How do you do that? All of that gets accumulated into knowledge. Okay. Now, when I take this best operation templates, which is embedded in this knowledge, and apply it not only to this plant, but across similar plants, or across similar aircrafts, or across similar robots, then I get consistency in best practices. In the example that I gave you earlier, if I'm talking about average performance and the best performance, if most of the time my performance is average here, if I apply knowledge, I might be able to push it up and up closer to the benchmark in a consistent manner. So I improve the performance and get benefits in a more consistent manner. So that is what data can help you to do. As you distill the data, you get information. As you distill information, you get knowledge. Still knowledge, you get wisdom. You can exploit that wisdom in several different ways, which I will show you as we go ahead. So bottom line is, listen carefully to data, but they have a very interesting and useful story to be revealed. Okay? So where are we now in the data analytics area? Okay, this slide is actually a little dated, but I'll tell you where. Societal systems in general, what we do, we tend to stick in sensors wherever we feel uncomfortable. So we kind of tend to err on the higher side and stick in a lot of sensors. Okay. In general, manufacturing units are data rich, but information poor. There's a lot of data, huge amounts of data. What do you do with that data? You archive it. What do you archive it in? They call it as a data graveyard. Okay, there's so much of data archived, but nobody knows what to do about it. It's information poor. Can we exploit the data to get more information, knowledge, and wisdom? In terms of size, we are currently in the age of actually not petabytes, but exabytes, EB that you see here, right? Currently, we are at EB as far as manufacturing is concerned. But just to place where it is, and I think the next slide shows that, we all know KB, we know MB, we know gigabytes, we know terabytes, because this is all where our computers are. But the next order of magnitude is petabytes, exabytes, zettabytes, and yottabytes. Okay. So looking at the sizes, we are somewhere here, tending towards here already now. Okay. Most importantly, in addition to this huge volume of data that is being spewed out of any manufacturing unit, what we additionally have is the nature of the data, which is a challenge. For example, and I'll show you that example a couple of slides later, we can have numbers that are spewing out from our sensors. We could have images. We could have acoustics, frequency information. We could have infrequency in the data itself. So in general, the nature of the data is very diverse. Over and above that, the velocity, the variety, veracity. If you add all of that into the 4 V's, if you add all of that, then you have a really, really challenging problem at hand if you want to make decisions at various time scales, immediate, relatively slowly, even slowly, and so on. If you have to make those decisions, you really have a challenging problem at hand. How do we generate meaningful interpretations from this data? And how do we derive useful procedures to operate and run our plants better? So this is where we are. You already saw this slide, but it's a growing area. A typical chemical manufacturing plant archive runs into exabytes. Okay, it's quite huge here. And to give you this YouTube, this has far exceeded. It has gone almost up to Zeta now. The YouTube, what you see on the YouTube. Okay. Now this is what I want to illustrate to you as the example of sensor diversity. Now all of us know, especially those who are in the chemical process industry, but even otherwise, that we use up a lot of steam, right? We use high pressure steam, medium pressure steam, low pressure steam. How is this steam generated? The steam is generated in a boiler. How does the boiler run? There is coal or fuel being fired into the combustor. There is a flame coming out. The flame essentially is impinging on a set of tubes which carry a boiler feed water, and that boils up, it generates steam, and that steam is used for various applications. Okay. So if I now have this problem of how do I run my boiler at its peak efficiency, just look at that simple problem. I can, as my common sense dictates, embed as many sensors that I can meaningfully do. Okay. So one sensor is, let's say, on the fuel quality. Is the fuel quality at its right value? Okay. The second sensor I can stick in is an acoustic sensor, which essentially, when a flame burns, it produces a sound. Okay. You can look at the frequency. In fact, you might have tried this on at home when you're lighting up your gas cylinders, your gas stoves. If it is burning at a higher intensity, its frequency is higher than if it is burning at a lower frequency. So that gives you some idea of the intensity. You can have thermal sensors around the area of the flame. You could have flame images from which you can extract the flame. And then you can have emission information as to how much of unburnt fuel is there in the emissions. Okay. So you could employ or deploy many more sensors. But if you just think about this, we are talking about several sensors that can come up. Now just look at what each of these sensors gives you. A fuel quality sensor, take a sample, send it to the lab. It's infrequent in nature, once every hour, once every 3 hours, maybe once every shift. Okay. Acoustic sensors, they give you frequency information. Thermal sensors give you numerical information. What's the temperature? The flame images give you images. How do you process those images? Emission again gives you numbers. Okay. Now you want to bring all of this sensor information together to assess the quality of the combustion. How do you do this now? Right? A flame, if it is burning blue, it is clean burning. If it is burning orange, there is an unburnt fuel. It's a sooty flame. It's orange. So that tells you that something is not right. What is the volume of the flame? Is the volume of the flame big? Does it dark? Does it dark, or does it shrink, or does it become extinct? Right? The flame monitoring will give you what is the health of the flame in terms of its volume, in terms of its color. It will give you that, and that can be used in terms of the flame parameters for extraction. Right? So all of this information, when aggregated together, this gives you some sense of the combustion quality assessment. How good is this combustion happening? Okay? Once you're able to assess the quality of this combustion, does that help you? It helps you only as a starting point. What can you do with that quality? First of all, how do you assess that quality? When you assess the quality, you say quality is good. What does good mean? There is a benchmark, which is excellent or best. There is good, maybe there is an average, and there is poor. If you say it is good, yes, it is here, but how do I compare this as with the excellent, and how do I differentiate saying what decisions I need to make in terms of the air firing or the fuel firing so that I go as close to the excellent as possible? To be able to do all of this, what I need is first place it relative to the best known benchmark, so assessment, use a combustion system model which essentially takes all of these measurements, looks at where it is relative to what it can do. So all of this information then goes into an advanced optimization and control algorithm. This advanced optimization and control algorithm will assess based on the assessment, based on where it can go, what are the operating constraints. It can put all of this together and come up with a decision advisory that promotes high efficiency combustion closer to the benchmark, right? So if you really want to do all of this, you have to go through this process which I mentioned here of data to information. So what have we done here? You have data, which is from different variety of data. Bring all of that together, generate information about the health of the combustion. Then compare it with the best known. Look at the knowledge in terms of a system model. How best you can apply this. Do this, get consistency, and do this repeatedly over and over again till you go as close to the benchmark as possible, right? So this is where there is a challenge. And just to summarize here, what we are talking about in manufacturing is a digital tsunami. What you have here is basically a problem just like a fresh trainee that you see, the girl over there is a fresh trainee. She is holding a hose pipe, okay, and she is trying to douse the flame. And there is a engineer who is trying to help her, training her how to do this. But actually what we have in practice is streams, bits and bytes of data that are spewing out of a manufacturing enterprise. And you need to have sophisticated advanced algorithms to make sense of this data and then use it in a suitable manner. So again, what this means is tapping into a data stream is like drinking from a fire hose pipe. And when you do this, if you have a cup, you can never fill that hose pipe. You need to have really, really sophisticated algorithms that you can use to be able to make sense of that data and use it in a suitable manner. Okay, so the main message is need a paradigm shift in the way we operate our plants, listen carefully to our plant, interpret the signals that it gives into meaningful information, build knowledge using this information, and evolve safe, improved, compliant operating policies. Very, very important to again stress the point that when you operate a plant, you want to operate it optimally in an excellent manner, but the primary objective also has to be safety. So compliance is very, very important. So safe, improved, optimal, and compliant operating policies as an output of a decision support system that comes out from your knowledge layer. The topmost layer is something that we want to aim at. There is a data deluge. There's just too much of data and no wisdom. So you need to rescue the data from the archives, from what they call as a data graveyard. Don't let data overload lead to information overload. Don't think of sticking in a sensor. In fact, in our discussions with the industry, whenever we have, they say, sir, there is no sensor there, we can't get that information. Where to deploy that sensor is just as important. Okay, so don't just deploy sensors because there is a need. Don't let data overload lead to information overload. Look for nuggets in the hay. Do not make more hay. Okay? And more importantly, translate this data into actionable information. Right? Let's just step back here. We talked about an operating process. Let's step back here. Are there opportunities for data analytics, AI, and ML? Where are they in a typical product life cycle? Okay. So in a typical product life cycle, you start with discovery, then you do lab scale development, you do pilot scale development, then you operate it into a plant scale. So for example, at the lab scale, you establish feasibility, you maintain yields and purities. Okay? You generate a lot of data, but what happens at the lab scale does not carry over to the pilot scale. What happens at the pilot does not carry over to the plant scale. Okay? Typical applications are in catalyst screening, new product grades, established process conditions, feasibility check. This is what you will try to do here. And there is an opportunity to carry this data right from the lab scale up to the plant scale by doing both intra-stage learning, which at this point you might want to do experimental design, model discrimination, but also as you scale up, interstage learning, modeling the effect of scale up and establishing protocols at the plant scale. Okay? So how do you do this now? You essentially have to answer this question, can data generated over different phases of the product life cycle, can this be leveraged? The answer is represent what is known from your physics. What is known from your physics? Represent. What is unknown? We empiricize to begin with. But more importantly, adapt and update as you get more and more data at the pilot scale, the lab scale, pilot scale, and the plant scale. Now, let's step back even a layer before the lab scale. Even at the lab scale, what you're doing is you have discovered a molecule, you have a reaction, and based on that reaction and that molecule, you feel that lab scale feasibility checks have to be done, pilot scale scale up has to be done, and then plant scale. Now, how do you even know what is a feasible molecule? Okay? What is that reaction? What is that reaction? Okay? To be able to do this as well, one needs to go into more fundamental aspects of the physics. Density functional theory, for example, some of you might have heard DFT, okay? Molecular simulations. Based on those and the feasibility of the end expected target properties of the molecule, you design a molecule. Even there, AI and ML approaches have found a lot of value nowadays that you can come up with a discovery of a molecule. So basically what we're talking about here is going back. This arrow is directional in this manner. You can also direct it back in this manner and start looking at the discovery of your process so that all of this is feasible. Okay? And this is increasingly getting a lot of research focus going back and forth along this, integrating all of these steps in a manner that you come up with a molecule that is feasible right up to the plant scale. Okay? That's also beginning to happen. Now, okay, I think I've been talking a lot, so let me just pause. Are there any questions at this point? And let me also say a quick hello to those of you who joined a little late. Oh, I'm just delighted. There are so many people who have been able to join. For those of you who joined late, let me first offer a very profuse apology from our side. We did not anticipate the technical hitch that came up. This Microsoft Live meeting works seamlessly without any hitch within IIT Bombay campus. But when we opened it out to the external world, we did not anticipate there was a hitch. And so my most sincere apologies. The ones who have joined late, we started at 5:45 and we'll be going up to 7:15. And then we'll take a call on the second lecture. I just want to pause here and open up the floor for some questions based on my preamble so far. Any questions up to this point, please? Okay. How many participants do we have overall? Okay, we have 23 participants. Yeah, that's good. This session is being recorded, by the way, and so the session will also be made available online at a later point in time. So if there are no questions, let me go back to my presentation. I hope I am heard. Maybe somebody can confirm I'm being heard. Om Prakash, can you confirm?
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
Okay, all right. I presume the same would be true with everyone. So let me again share my screen and go ahead. Yes, thank you. Yeah. So if you recall, I talked about several sources of information. We talked about, in good manufacturing practices, we talked about first principles physics. Then we talked about, being able to deploy continuous improvement by using measurements, and then have better understanding and keep getting better and better as far as our operation is concerned. So let's just look at approaches to knowledge extraction and refinement. Okay? As I said, we have models. What is a model? As engineers, we all can write in our individual disciplines, domains, we can write kinematic balances, mass and energy balances, 6 degree of freedom balances for kinematics for the aircraft and the like. So these models are based on certain postulates, hypotheses, which we know to be true. Okay, so for example, energy mass balance, whatever goes into a system comes out of the system. We know that this has to be true. Okay, so we write models based on the physics of the system. Okay, there are certain aspects in this physics that are based also need what we call as constitutive relationships. For example, in chemical engineering, if I have a reactor, I know that what mass enters has to leave. But the constitutive relationship is associated with the kinetics of the reaction. Likewise, in kinematics, I can write the kinematic balances, but the stiffness constants, for example, or the relationship of the stiffness with the fatigue and the various metal properties is something that's a constitutive relationship. In an aircraft, for example, I can write the 6 degree of freedom, but the sensitivity is something that is not known from the physics. We need to estimate it from wind tunnel experiments. So, you have a lot of incompleteness in the models that you propose. Okay, those incomplete aspects you can try to complement using measurements. So the second source of information, if you see this slide, is measurements. Okay, we have models that generate the truth, but unknown. The truth is not completely known. You have measurements that give you additional information, but now remember that the measurements can also be affected by bias or noise. So even the measurement is not complete. It is also in error. If I have models, I have measurements. And finally, I have a third source of information. Oftentimes, what I can do is I can try to estimate or know for myself how accurate is my model or how accurate is my measurement. Okay? If my model I know is not very accurate, I have an understanding of what is the mismatch associated with that model. Okay? If my measurements are not accurate, I know what's the extent, or I could estimate what is the extent of measurement noise associated with that. So now I can consider that as a third source of information. Okay? So models, measurements, and mismatch or noise as quantified. Depending on these sources, I need to make suitable decisions on how I can do knowledge extraction and knowledge refinement, both extracting from the model as well as from the measurements with the knowledge of the mismatch. So there are a few scenarios that I would like to present to you. One is accurate model, noisy measurements. If I have an accurate model, which means I just write a simple mass balance, that's my accurate model, but my measurements are noisy, I could do something called data reconciliation. So essentially what I do here, I know that my measurements are noisy. I can estimate, I can reconcile those measurements so that they agree with the mass and energy balances, either in the static case or in the dynamic case. So that is typically called data reconciliation. In fact, we have one talk scheduled by Professor Mani Bhushan on this aspect of data reconciliation. Okay? I could have a noisy model. I could have noisy measurements as well. But there is certain amount of known completeness in the model and a certain amount of information in the measurements. In that case, I can use this entire theory called estimation and filtering, which has been very, very popular in both research as well as applying to the industry, especially where the product quality is of significant concern. We use this. Okay? The model can be partly known or partially known, but then measurements are noisy. I could use gray box modeling, gray box because it fuses partially known physics with measurements. So it's a gray box modeling, and I could do adaptation. Yes, yes. There's a question. Okay. If there is a model uncertainty, which is very high, and also my measurements are extremely noisy, I could completely use black box modeling, multivariate statistics, artificial neural networks, fuzzy reasoning, and the power of AI tools. Okay. So depending on the extent of first principles physics, I have extent of noise in your measurements. I could at a very high level classify some of the research and practice into some of these algorithms. Now, when you talk to anybody about AI and ML, the first thing they will tell you is AI and ML is all about this last class, but actually it is not. Okay. In fact, as I start bringing more and more about my physics into the system, that is also called AI. In fact, I would classify that I would re-acronym. I could use an acronym AI to not only mean artificial intelligence but augmented intelligence. Where, in addition to artificial intelligence tools, I will also use physics and combine all of that to generate an augmented knowledge about the system, which I can exploit more meaningfully for my intended application. Okay? So let's look at typical objectives of data analytics. Usually, as I said, we have an inflated measurement space. So one of the objectives of data analytics could be that in this inflated measurement space, if I want to get a view of the underlying latent space, then I need to perform what is this task called dimensionality reduction. Okay, so I can collapse the measurement space into a lower dimension that typically helps me to understand and give some guarantees in a better manner. I'll show you an example. Many times I might also want to discover patterns and clusters in the data. What does that mean? Let's take this example. I gave this example of an average performance, a superior performance, a good performance, and a poor performance. And you can see that there are 4 classes of data here, right? So one class is excellent operation. Second class is average operation, good operation, and poor operation. Okay. Can the data, when I generate when the process is operating in one of these modes, I cannot just look at the process data and say which class it belongs to, right? So what I want an algorithm to do, an analytical algorithm to do, is to look at this data, especially when it is archived into a database. I want to look at this data, query that data, mine that data, and try to discover patterns and clusters in the data. How is this helpful? Because once I have a pattern associated with poor operation, and I know the pattern associated with improved operation, I can look for ways by which I can improve or move the poor operation to an improved operation, right? So that is necessary for me. So I need to establish the patterns and clusters in the data. A second example I can give you is that of a nuclear plant, a nuclear power plant. When I'm operating a nuclear power plant, it's a safety critical application. I want to be able to classify normal modes from safety critical modes. So I want to be able to classify from a fault detection and diagnosis perspective. Okay, so that could be a second objective of data analytics. Building soft sensors for inferencing of variable and metrics. Many times, what I want to control is not measurable at a frequency that I want. Okay, So what I can do, I need to infer what I cannot measure. I need to infer what I cannot measure using other measurements that I can measure more frequently. Okay. When I do this, so for example, in a distillation column, there is a composition that I want to control very, very tightly in the top distillate. For those of you who are not chemical engineers in the participant list, in a distillation column, I get a mixture and I distill it into a pure product up at the top and at the bottom. If it's a mixture, I separate out the mixture into top and bottom. There are certain quality specifications on what is the purity in the top and purity in the bottom. Okay, but I can't sense that purity at a rate that I would like. It is, because if I have to take corrective action, I need to be able to sense it very, very rapidly. But there are just no sensors out there. Okay, what I can do is I can infer the quality by using other sensors or other measurements like temperature that give me an indication of what this quality is. Okay, that is typically called a soft sensor, and I'll explain that in a short while. When I'm doing closed loop control, there is a session on performance benchmark for closed loop control. We want to generate reduced variance estimates for closed loop control. I'll talk about that complement available first principles information. I need to be able to generate predictive models for diagnostics. I talked about diagnostics here very briefly in terms of the nuclear application, but prognostics. What is prognostics? Diagnostics is like, a fault has happened and I want to find out what's the root cause. Prognostics is, can I predict that a fault is likely to happen? Okay. How do I do this? I need to look at incipient signatures that tell us what an impending fault, right? So prognostics, again, data analytics helps you to do this. And then continuous performance assessment, be it at the control loop, be it at the systemic level, be it at the higher systemic level. What I want to do is I want to have a system of systems, if you will, and make sure that every system is monitored in terms of its performance by a higher level system and a higher level system and a higher level. And at the highest level, it will be human beings who would essentially look at it. So that's something that data analytics will help you to do. Some of the objectives are as here. Okay? What are the basic challenges in data analytics? One is the design problem. We are saying data, obviously, must be of the right quality. It must be of the right, it must give you the right kind of information, right? So what to measure? What is the frequency? Where do you locate it? It's a sensor location, sensor network design problem, which Professor Manibhushan, one of the teachers in this course, has worked an extensive research on. Okay? How to transform and visualize the data, outliers, nonlinear effects. This is something very useful in control valve, stiction, and the like. Likewise, how to present the data in a form suitable for analysis, streaming, aggregated. How do you look at this data? Visualization is extremely important when you're doing data analytics. How do I transform the data, right? Now, analysis problem. This is a design problem. You want to place and present the data. Analysis problem has to do with how do you deal with complexity in size, huge volumes. We're talking about volumes and velocities, huge amounts of data. There could also be collinearity in the data, and this is a numerical issue associated with processing of the data, right? If you have collinearity, it becomes a difficult problem in analysis, something that we need to deal with. There could be heterogeneity and non-linearity in the data. How do you accommodate that? Heterogeneity meaning images, infrequency. How do you take care of that? How do you deal with low signal to noise ratio? When I'm doing fuzzy reasoning, if I have multiple memberships, how do I take care of that? I'll talk about this a little while later. Okay? And likewise, when I have modeling knowledge, how do I complement this with data, with according appropriate relative importance to models as well as measurements? And all of this constitutes what's called as the analysis problem. Okay? So let me begin with this general problem first. We have actual system whose causes are hopefully deterministic. You make them or a controller makes them. You have an effect that is measured which is corrupted with measurement noise. I can also have disturbances and drifts. And this is the general manufacturing system. What we actually have is a model of the system, okay, where the causes are again deterministic. The effects are something that is predicted, and the same estimate of the disturbances is what we have that goes to the model. Okay? And what we have is a problem where the cause and effect relationships. In analytics, we are always worried about this cause and effect relationship. Okay? And what we want to do is see what is the nature of that cause and effect relationships. It could be complex. The non-linearity could be there. Dynamic nature could be there. It could be time varying, normal, different classes of operation, abnormal situations, parameter shifts. So how do I look at these cause and effect relationships? I can look at it one way is by looking at a data matrix X that belongs to this space n cross n, R n cross n. So n samples in n variables. Okay, so each of the samples are along the row, each of the variables are along the column, and you want to be able to view this data in an appropriate space so that it helps you to reveal what is the underlying phenomena. Okay? Now, several classes of relationships could exist. There could be overlaps, and we need to deal with this. So, knowledge, the first thing that comes is how do you represent this knowledge? Okay? So, you could never represent this knowledge, as I said here, when you say model, you could represent this knowledge first in terms of the white box models, which is the physics, the gray box models, which is something that comes between a white box and a black box. So when you combine, a black box is a completely empirical model, a white box is a completely physics-based model. When I combine these two, I get something called as a gray box model. And depending on this, I can represent the knowledge that's present in these models. Okay? And now let's look at each of these in that manner. Okay. When I have first principles knowledge and data, and I perform this task of parameter estimation, to do this, I can use various regression methods. I get what's called as a white box model. Okay. On the far extreme, when I use only data and I use statistical methods like the multivariate statistics, neural networks, artificial intelligence-based tools, I get a black box model. But somewhere interim between these, I have partial first principles knowledge, I have data, and this can give me a gray box model. Okay, so really what we are talking about is when we went back here and we described this model, this is an articulation of how do you represent knowledge in that model, and in terms of how do you represent it depending on which class it belongs. Extent of physics known, data, partial physics known, no physics known. I can have any or all of these scenarios. Okay. Now let's delve into each of those problems that I mentioned here in terms of the objectives. Let's look at the first problem, which is data reconciliation. I think this is something that Professor Manibhushan will spend more time on as a separate lecture. But when you talk of a data reconciliation problem, we are talking of raw measurements which are noisy. Okay. We have a process model which we know to be fairly accurate from the physics point of view. But now we want to derive certain metrics from the measurements. So what we do is we need to correct these measurements in the presence of noise using the accuracy of a model. So when it's subjected to this data reconciliation method, we get reconciled measurements. Okay. A case in point is if I have to meet a mass balance, which is my process model, and I have noisy measurements, I can correct the measurements to obey the mass balance model, which is the reconciled measurements. Okay. So what it does, it assumes that the model constraints are accurate and reconciles measurements to the model. It better estimate. Many times what happens is, I talked about the average level of performance and the best level of performance. Okay. How do I know that it's what is the current level? Is it average or is it best? I base it on the measurements, but these measurements are noisy at this point. So I reconcile those measurements. I already have a set of reconciled measurements here. I compare the reconciled measurements here with the best known operation, right? So that's where it gives you a better estimate of your current operating points. Sometimes it could help you to correct random errors in the measurements. If I have a sensor drift, I have a sensor bias, it helps me to correct that. It helps me to detect cross errors, sensor failures, or stream leakages, water distribution networks, gas pipeline networks. If I want to detect the leakage, it helps me to do that. It helps me to estimate unmeasured or inaccessible streams. Okay? So some of these applications are there for both static as well as dynamic variants. Okay? That is data reconciliation. I look at the data compression problem. Next, let me just pause here. Any questions up to this point? Any questions up to this point? Okay. I would encourage you, please, let it not be a monologue. All of you are faculty in different colleges. I think we should have this as a dialogue where, if something is not clear, you should pause me and you should ask questions. So maybe I should take a pause and let you think. So give it 1 minute if you have any questions up to this point. So what we are doing here is now we are looking at objectives, different objectives, and looking at specific instances where data analytics is helpful. I'm just going to take a few examples, but just want to pause there. Any questions from any of you, please? Okay. Okay. I think Dr. Kavita mentions that you understand the concepts, but you want to look at applications. Yes, those are also coming up here. So, I talked about the data compression problem. So, essentially, this data compression problem is important in revealing the lower dimension subspace. Many times what we have is a lot of redundancies in the way we deploy our sensors, generate an artificially inflated measurement system, instrumentation and control systems. Okay, many of these, there is a need to look at the inflated data space and try to compress it. Okay, if you have to assess this inflated data space, it does pose computational difficulties. If you look at it in the original domain, many times it may not be so important to look at this inflated space. Not important meaning that while each measurement information is useful, there is a lot of redundancy. So I want to compress that and look in the lower dimension space. Mathematically, matrix factorization methods have been used quite meaningfully, or with a significant impact here. And so let's look at one example here of how this is done. Here is what I show you, in terms of simple example of how data compression can be done. This is the furnace where steam gets generated, fuel is fired. Okay, how to correct random errors in measurements? Yes, random errors in measurements can be corrected using data reconciliation, and Professor Manibhushan will, in his session, talk a lot about that. First is, detecting the cross errors. You have to detect that. That by itself is a problem. And the second is, the aspect of how do we correct it. So, detecting the problem, gross error detection is a very important aspect which will be dealt with in data reconciliation. Replacing it with its best estimate is something also that we can discuss. But gross errors, yes, it's a sore point, and detecting that early and being able to correct it will certainly be useful. Okay? So just pause your question and repose it when Professor Manibhushan's lecture is coming up. Okay? So in this example, we have fuel flow versus steam demand. Now, as we all know, as my steam demand increases, the fuel flow should increase. And so this is the measurement points that I get when I measure steam demand and when I measure the fuel flow, and I project it on this two-dimensional plot. Remember, this is not with respect to time, but this is with respect to y-axis is fuel demand and x-axis is fuel flow and x-axis is steam demand. Okay. Now, when you look at this, each of these points is one such point, and time is implicit maybe along this axis. Okay. Now, if I look at the variables one at a time in this inflated space of two variables, okay, what I can do is I can generate control limits for the fuel flow, which look like this upper dotted line and this lower dotted line. And likewise, I can generate control limits for the steam demand, which is this dotted line and this vertical dotted line. Okay. And so long as univariate, I get these measurements one at a time, and they lie within these limits, I will infer that the furnace is operating normally, and there is no problem with any of the sensors and like. Okay. Answer is no. If I do univariate monitoring, it cannot guarantee to me that a fault that is occurred can be detected, because in univariate, everything can fall within these limits. Okay. Now, these 2 points are actually abnormal data, but you can see that they fall between these vertical control limits and the horizontal control limits. But what it's saying, these 2 points are saying is when the steam demand is high, the fuel flow is low, which is not the correct thing. Okay. So what you need to do is, rather than monitor them individually, you need to monitor the relationship. Okay. And in a sense, it is doing a coordinate transformation by moving this, which is what I show you here. Okay. I'm just moving the coordinate system in this manner. And now if you see, my control limits are on that relationship. The brown dotted line are the control limits for the light dotted line, the mean of all of these measurements. Okay. And now these control limits can guarantee for me that these points will not be misclassified as a normal operating point. They are indeed abnormal data point because they fall outside of these control limits. Okay. So now what have you done? What have we done here is, this is an artificially inflated space. I have two measurements, okay, but they are correlated in this manner. So I've captured that correlation into this single dimension, and I'm monitoring that dimension. Okay, and this linear combination is what is one way of reducing the dimension or doing dimensionality reduction. Okay, there are more sophisticated approaches which we will consider a little later when we are doing what's called principal components analysis. But this is just a kind of a early view of what principal components analysis is all about. Okay. Let's look at the second example of fault detection and diagnosis. Now I have said here PCA, principal components analysis, here at the bottom. So we have not introduced that to you, but I'm just wanting to bring this here as an opportunity of how data and first principles models can be synergistically combined to reap the benefits of artificial intelligence tools. Okay, so this is an excellent example of that, and this is a live industry example. Okay, where we are doing monitoring of a polyethylene reactor. Okay, so fault detection and diagnosis. What is the problem? How do we generate an early indication of an event that is going to occur that is adverse? Can we diagnose? And then what is the root cause? So detection is being able to detect early. Diagnosis to find out what variables contributed to it. Okay. If this is done early, then it can alert the operators and provide associated indicators to verify that what is the problem. Okay. So now what we want to do is just look at this simple example. Okay. What we have done here is we have essentially looked at combining a data analytics based tool like PCA with a first principles model associated with this low density polyethylene reactor. Now, those of you are not from the chemical engineering domain, polyethylene is basically a polymer of ethylene. So this is ethylene, N molecules of ethylene combined to give you polyethylene. Okay. This reaction This reaction is typically carried out in a reactor, which is prone to generate hotspots. Side reactions are there, which generate a high amount of high exothermicity, potentially leading to explosive reactions. And of course, this ethylene gets converted to the side reaction, so there's also an economic loss. Okay, so you want to be able to detect this undesirable reactions at an early stage, so that the hotspots minimization corrective action is taken. Okay, so here are the measurements are associated with that. We have ethylene flow rates, initiator flow rates, unreacted ethylene and product flow rates going out. Okay, so what is it that we can do? Okay, what is it that we can do? If you are going to do this from first principles physics, what we would do is we would write an energy balance. So this is the input energy that is coming in. This is the input energy. Okay, this is this is the output energy. I'm sorry, this is what leaves. This is what comes in. This is what comes in through the initiators. So feed gas and initiators. All of this is what comes in. All of this is what leaves. This is what gets generated due to reaction. And if an energy balance has to be obeyed, then this must be close to zero. Okay? So I can write this energy balance and try to monitor this energy balance. Okay? But many times what happens is that this energy balance term has component enthalpies. And these enthalpies are a function of temperature. And there is an uncertainty associated with them. But temperature measurements are available. CP is not exactly known. Okay. So what we want to be able to do is look at this enthalpy balance equation and try to use PCA along with this. Now, how do we do this? We treat each temperature measurement as available measurement. We use this model and integrate these two. How do we integrate these two? Here is how we do this. Each of these terms is put into H1, H2, Hi, which are all functions of temperature which are known. The CPs are unknown, so they are alphas. Okay. And what we want to do is we want to monitor that all of this essentially adds up to zero. Okay. So temperature measurements are there. We try to monitor this relationship. Sorry. We want to monitor this relationship in such a way that there is an energy balance closure. Okay, so what we do is we perform something called principal components analysis. Each of this is like a measurement, right, dependent on temperature, and we monitor the error in terms of bounds on the error using principal components analysis. We establish thresholds on this error based on that. Okay, and so when we look at this, and this is an actual example from an LDPE reactor. When we looked at monitoring this closure error, up to this point, there was no problem. But you see, it began to go up here, began to go down here. Okay. And when it was actually violated these control limits, 3 minutes before that, the algorithm was able to say when there was a sharp increase. See, look at all of these increases. These are slow increases. Okay. But when there's a sharp increase, you know that there's an onset of a reaction, right? So that was detected 3 minutes before the actual decomposition. So if you look at this and this, the 3 minute kind of a difference, it was detected and corrective action could be taken so that side reactions, did not lead to an explosion. Okay? So this is an example where we combined first principles knowledge, which is this, along with measurements, which are the temperatures, and did use a data analytics based approach to monitor the performance of this reactor. Okay, so this is an excellent example where PCA is known to work in a synergistic manner. So let me again pause here. Are there any questions at this point? I think I'll just pause to see if I have missed any questions. I can do that only when I stop sharing. So let me just look at the chat box. Understand the concepts with how to correct random errors. Okay. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Please post, or to save time, let us just ask them in the audio mode. Any questions? Okay. I'll again share my screen. Okay. So we saw this example. Now let's look at the data clustering problem. What is the data clustering problem? Again, as a repeat of my earlier slide, there could be several classes of relationships. There could be overlap amongst those classes. Can we do something about it? Can we look at the data? If we project it into a space, it might show overlaps. I want to resolve these classes. Now, typical applications are resolve a normal class from an abnormal class. If I want to do nonlinear identification also, we can show that this helps. So what is this classification problem? It's basically finding a structure in huge amounts of data. I might be operating a polymer reactor, and this polymer reactor can operate polymers at different grades. But when I take the measurement and archive it, it all gets archived into the archive as a single huge matrix. Okay. The question is now, how do we make sense of this huge matrix? Can I mine into the data, and can I segregate the data to be able to reveal certain useful relationships? For example, I list 4 of them here. When I look at a regression problem, if I look at a regression problem, I want to find out or cluster data points in such a way that the data points within a cluster obey a relationship, a linear or a nonlinear relationship, but the same relationship. Okay. When I'm doing fault detection and diagnosis, I want to represent points associated with normal behavior and abnormal behavior so that I'm able to establish the patterns associated with them. In medical practice, systems biology, I want to identify genes that are responsible for a specific regulatory function using microarray data. Okay. In system identification, when I'm doing model building exercise, I want to look at regions of linear operation if I want to deploy a multi-model control approach. Okay. So general requirements for clustering, when I am talking about an artificial intelligence-based tool that can delve into this matrix and try to build clusters depending on my end objective, I want to be able to deal with different types of attributes. Okay, I want to be able to say, is it an image? Is it a blue image? Is it a green image? Is it somewhere in between, and so on? I want to be able to discover clusters with arbitrary shape. I'll tell you why. Okay, let's start right. I want to be able to resolve between clusters. If I have an overlap, I want to be able to look at the data in a new space so that I can resolve between these clusters. Okay. Otherwise, I end up with misclassification. In regions of overlap, I might actually get a misclassification. I want to be able to deal with noise and outliers, always the problem. I want to accommodate high dimensionality. I want to use minimum systemic knowledge about the domain. Okay. And finally, I want to be able to detect clusters which are interpretable and which are usable. Okay. So how do I do all of this? A high view of what is a clustering method. They are typically hierarchical clustering. Hierarchical clustering essentially says that I can either adopt an agglomerative or a divisive. Agglomerative is I look at one data at a time and start looking at similarity of a next data point with this data point and start agglomerating. If they're not similar, I build 2 such classes. Look at the third point. Is it similar to the first 2? In what way? If not, build a third cluster. So I start agglomerating those clusters and building. If it is similar, I get 2 points in a cluster, 3 points in a cluster, 4, and then I agglomerate in that. In a divisive, what I have to do is I start with the big block and I start chopping them down. Okay, build those individual clusters. So this is hierarchical kind of a clustering. Now this clustering can either be hard clustering or fuzzy clustering. Hard clustering means one data point or a feature belongs exactly to one cluster. Okay, in fuzzy clustering, I can accommodate the belonging of one data point to more than one cluster. Okay, And there are variants for that, which we will see. And of course, there's also this probabilistic clustering, which is based on mixture of Gaussians. Maybe a little advanced concept. I will not cover that as part of this. Okay. There was a question. Let me just quickly see. Was there a question? I mean, you should please don't just post it there. If it is something urgent, you should ask. Okay. The question is from Rajiv Ranjan. How much AI into prognostic preventive maintenance? Oh, there is a huge amount of AI that goes into prognostics. Okay. There is just, when you say prognostics, you're talking about a problem where you want to predict early. If you want to be able to predict early, you are basically looking at what we have right now in terms of signatures and patterns, trying to compare that from the archive into known patterns, and then be able to say that, okay, this corresponds to this known pattern, and this pattern has resulted into an explosion. Okay, or it has been classified as something that will result into an explosion. We don't let anything go into an explosion, hopefully, but at least it's a pattern that goes to an explosion. So if there is a similarity with a known pattern, there is easily a prognostics possibility available with the current measurements, right? Because they're comparing it with what is there in the archive. Okay, so to do this comparison, a lot of AI reasoning is required, and there is an opportunity there. Okay. Let me just show you this in terms of discrimination. So, I talked about this point of, being able to discriminate or resolve between clusters. What I show you here is an example taken from one of the medical applications. So here is the original data. In the original data in this space, it essentially looks like there is a significant overlap. Okay. So when I get a new data point and it falls somewhere here, where the arrow is, I do not know whether it belongs to the blue cluster or whether it belongs to the red cluster. Okay. But if I'm able to apply AI tools and transform the data, I can resolve it in a new space. It will look like this. Okay. And now if I get the same data point, I can subject it to the same amount of transformations, and there I will be able to clearly discriminate whether it belongs to the red or the blue. Okay. Likewise, this is an example, another medical application where we can do resolution because of aggregation. Now, if you see, all of these are so diverse, but when I look at it in the best example is these inverted triangles here. You see, they all coalesce into a single point. Okay. If you look at this purple points, they are diverse here. You get into this. So transformation of the original data into a new data space essentially results in aggregation, and that can improve your chances of resolution. Okay. Here is another example of a chemical engineering application where a high purity distillation column is approached using multi-model control. What is multi-model control? You see that in a high purity distillation column, as I go to higher and higher levels of purity, I need an enormous amount of reflux to achieve that. Now that process is classified as a highly nonlinear process. Okay? So if I have to do this, you see that there are 4 models here. One is in a relatively lower region of purity, and in a very high region of purity, the time constant is very high. Okay? Because there is a lot of reflux, there is a lot of boil up, and there is significant amount of dynamics in the system. So if I have to do this control, I need 4 models, and I can do fuzzy reasoning to switch between models in such a way that I can achieve a high level of accurate control at the purity level. Okay, more about this application when we go a little later into the sessions. Okay. A data regression problem. Okay, in a data regression problem, this is an excellent example where I combine models with measurements. You see, this is the actual process. This is the model of the process that is used in parallel with the process. This is the measurements that are generated. And I can use several algorithms like Kalman filtering, moving horizon filtering, particle filtering to essentially generate estimates of what's happening in this process, both in terms of what's measured as well as what is unmeasured, and also some of the parameters of the system. Okay, so there is a lot of opportunity here when you're talking about digital twins and trying to get your models to agree with your actual plant operation. I'll just skip this in the interest of time, but maybe I'll just spend some time on this one. If I'm doing a pharma batch, okay. Now, pharma batch is a very, very challenging application because pharmaceutical products are used mostly for human consumption and therapy. Okay? So they have a very, very high level of stringent quality control. B, they are extremely expensive. So when they're expensive, you don't want a failed batch. You want each batch to be highly productive and yield the quality which is very high. Okay? So you want to closely monitor the batch. Okay? You want to make sure that every batch is operating as per the specified standard operating procedures. Okay? But what typically happens is batch to batch variation is very, very common. Okay? If I want to be able to ensure a narrow variation between batches, I need to monitor its quality so that when its quality is falling, I can take corrective action to push it as close to the what they call as a golden batch as possible. And here is one example where we did this using AI tools and data analytics. Okay, I show you three things here: predicted titer, predict and run length. These are the quality metrics. And here is the performance index on a scale of 0 to 9. This is poor, this is average, and there is no point that is good as far as this batch is concerned. Okay. I'll skip this. This is more from the diagnosis point of view, but more time I will spend later, which helps you to say which are the key variables that are contributing to suboptimal operation or faulty operation in the context of a pharma batch. I'll talk about performance assessment and characterization. So we are talking about using data now to do performance monitoring and performance assessment. So it's important to distinguish between the two. Performance monitoring is basically a continuous and real-time survey of critical plant variables that determine plant performance. For example, in the polyethylene reactor, you looked at temperatures, you looked at early signatures, and you are able to generate basically an advisory as to 3 minutes later there is going to be a runaway reaction. This is just a real-time survey. Okay. What is performance assessment? Performance assessment is the next step of performance monitoring. And when you say assessment, and all of us are teachers, we are assessing a performance, you want to be able to compare the current performance relative to a benchmark. Okay. There are two aspects associated here. One is establishing the benchmark and comparing the current performance related to the benchmark. Both these tasks are occupied with or associated with this term performance assessment. So highlight performance relative to the best known or achievable performance, assess, diagnose reasons for suboptimal performance, and then suggest potential remedies to improve the performance. Okay? So this is typically, all of this is associated with operational excellence. There is a lot of talk about operational excellence nowadays in manufacturing. And again, more about this in subsequent lectures. But basically, there are four information sources. Information sources go in, performance benchmarks go into all of this, quality metrics definition, and different mathematical algorithms that contribute to this to develop and make the process plant achieve operational excellence. But we'll talk about this, as during our lectures. Performance classification, I did mention about this. There could be some measures like productivity, specific energy as two quality metrics. Now, in the context, let's say, of a combustion process, I could say that the best operation is seen when specific energy is low and productivity is high. If I'm looking at a distillation column, specific energy is low, productivity is high, that is best. When I use high specific energy and low productivity, it is good, average, and the like. Okay? When I want to do operational excellence, what I want to do is I want to go from this distribution, and this is the benchmark. If I have this currently, when I implement operational excellence procedures, I go closer to the benchmark by going here. Okay? So this is what I want to do when I'm doing operational excellence, push it closer to the benchmark as possible, but first also establish this benchmark. Okay? Here is one example which I'll deal with in greater detail in process control performance assessment. So here what we have is a process control loop. Before tuning, it showed a lot of variation. Its performance index was low. After tuning, the variance became less, and this resulted in a 22% increase in catalyst life. Okay? That's where monitoring can help. When we do closed loop performance control, we are very much concerned about model plant mismatch detection. Okay? To be able to detect that, again, a lot of statistical quality control tools can be employed. Okay, what I show you here is again an example of a multivariable plant where I have more than one inputs to manipulate and several inputs, several outputs that I want to control. Okay, the multivariable control consists of all of these. Each of this is a transfer function matrix, and what I want to do is look at how good the models are in each of these transfer functions. Okay, if for example there is fouling in a heat exchanger or some other catalyst deactivation, these models will fail to be accurate from the time when they were commissioned. Okay, so I want to be able to detect this mismatch and be able to correct them. So this is a case study from a kerosene hydrotreater unit in Suncor Energy, where there were 3 MVs as I indicated and 7 quality control variables, and model predictive control was used, but its service factor was very, very low. It means how much time it was up. It was up only at the 11% of the time because it was giving a lot of problems. So operators switched it off, and so statistical measures can be used to detect. This is the schematic of that. There was significant violations on the normal limits of each of these controlled variables, and this was highlighted as a problem. So regular correlations, partial correlations. Regular correlations, of course, did not help in detecting mismatch, but partial correlation methodology helped us to detect that in these two channels there was a mismatch, and that helped in detecting that models were inaccurate, they need to be corrected, and once they were correct, the closed loop performance was restored. Okay, so this is another example of where statistical methods can help. Interaction and nonlinearity assessment. This is another approach where statistical tools can be quite helpful. And nonlinearity, most of the times we deal with the normal linear domain, but there are many examples in chemical engineering where there can be nonlinearities. So if you use control loops and use nonlinear linear controllers, there can be problems associated with performance. There could be control valve stiction. There could be shift in plant operation. So there are some higher order statistics. Over and above the standard statistics that we know in terms of mean, variance, and the like, spectrum coherence. There are bicoherence, bispectrum that can be used for nonlinearity detection that you see here. In this example, what you see here is the bicoherence, which essentially shows in this linear signal everything is flat, but if I have nonlinearity, it shows up as peaks, and this essentially points to the presence of nonlinearity and a control valve stiction. Okay, so these are some of the tools that can be used. Likewise, when I have interactions as well, statistical tools and can be used to be able to detect. One case in point is when I have large system of controllers. I have, for example, several controllers, power systems. This is a common problem in when I have in a city power being supplied from different power grids, and each of them are their own subsystem controllers, but they exchange power between them. Amongst them, they exchange power. If one of them makes decisions that the other bit does not know, and there is a possibility that they will collectively fail. Okay? So this interaction has to be detected once the power systems are up and running, and the left hand must know what the right hand is doing. Okay, so that coordinated decisions are made. So how do you detect the presence of these interactions is also a problem that AI and tools can help solve. So interaction detection, I think I'll just skip this. Maybe in the interest of time, we're already close to 7:15, but I'll just maybe show this for a large fluidized catalytic cracking unit. I can treat this as a single problem, like a single power control problem, or I could break it up into two sub problems. Okay, in which case there is a presence of an interaction, and we need to be able to make coordinated decisions. So let me just conclude here by saying that in the whole engineering domain, there are several problems of challenge that data analytics is posed with. In combustion monitoring, you can have boilers, gasifiers, IGCCs, where there's a diversity in nature of measurements. Environmental systems, in environmental systems, what we measure is only at the upper level, where I measure, let's say, a emission that is SOx, NOx, etc. But what is the source that has contributed to it is blind. You never know. It could be aggregated and then lead to that value. Okay. So how do I do a mining of the data to identify blind sources? In patient health monitoring, we saw a couple of examples. Engine health monitoring, where I have a diversity of sensors, causality detection in process systems for improved diagnosis. All of these are engineering problems of challenge in data analytics. And as we go ahead in this course, we will try to acquaint you with some of the advances that have happened in data analytics leading to AI and ML that can help you to take a shot at some of these problems and be able to get a better understanding of those tools. Okay, so I will stop here. I'm seeing my clock; it's already close to 7:15. I'll stop here in the interest of time, but I will be happy to take any questions, and then we can take a call on how do we go into the next lecture. So the floor is open for a couple of minutes for questions.
Professor Godi, there is one question in the chat box by Dr. Vinod Kumar.
Hi, Doctor.
Just above Rajiv Ranjan.
I think I thought I answered that question. Preventive condition-based maintenance. In fact,
there is just above that.
Lot of AI going into that. But as a further step, let me also add that preventive maintenance can tell you, okay, there is going to be a failure of this equipment, so you need to start maintaining or initiating preventive maintenance now. But going one step further, can we actually schedule the maintenance in such a way that no equipment is down when the requirements are high? We solved one such problem in the oil and gas sector, where in cold Siberian conditions, the oil is pumped using this electrical submersible pumps that go underground in that harsh environment, and the condition of the pump has to be closely monitored. The oil demands fluctuate, okay, and when it goes high, I want to have maximum number of pumps that are operational. So I can do preventive health monitoring to say, okay, now when I'm going to anticipate a peak in the oil demand, can I have at least 80% of my pumps up and running? So I need to integrate data analytics with optimization and find out which of these pumps I need to keep up so that I'm able to meet that demand. That those decisions also it can help. I hope I have answered your question, Dr. Rajiv Ranjan.
Sir, there is another question. What is the advantage of machine learning?
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. What is the
advantage of machine learning algorithm?
One can use neural network to reduce the computational time, whereas fuzzy logic is used for adapting in similar lines. What is the advantage? Oh, okay. This is asked by Dr. Vinod Kumar. Okay. See, machine learning, if you see, essentially has under it a suite of algorithms. Okay, it has fuzzy logic, it has neural networks, it has ways to different variants of deep learning, neural networks, deep learning, convolution neural networks. A whole bunch of these algorithms are there. Okay, uh, you know the if you trace the evolution of neural networks, when it started, it was just a simple backprop algorithm with just the feed-forward neural networks. Okay, but now once you start adding a little bit of complexity based on requirement, for example, if I want to model dynamics, my structure of the feed-forward neural network changes. When I want to embed knowledge into the neural networks, deep learning methods help. Okay, when I want to fuse first principles knowledge, okay, into this entire modeling framework, then what happens is I need to go beyond what a neural network can do. I need to go beyond that to be able to bring in fuzzy reasoning, to be able to bring in more advanced reasoning, so that in an integrated manner, all of this can represent knowledge. See, all of these approaches, AI and all of that, is primarily driven towards how well you can represent knowledge. And this knowledge can be, as I explained in my talk, coming from first principles physics. It can come from measurements. It also can represent uncertainty with both of these. Okay? If I want to represent this knowledge in a way that is, today I have this much of knowledge. Yeah, at this point, I have this much of knowledge. But as I start operating my plant, I gain more knowledge on the fly. Okay? Can I integrate that knowledge into and improve my understanding, broaden my understanding? So these opportunities of how I start with an initial set of knowledge, which could be just pure physics. How do I use my data? How do I use further advanced reasoning to be able to compare best templates with the current templates? Current templates with the best templates. I know that there is a gap. What contributes to this? What kind of decisions I have made in the past when I see a particular operating pattern? Can I use the same thing again? Can I redefine my constraints? Can I push my boundaries? All of these answers to these questions come from using the power of artificial intelligence. Okay? Artificial intelligence, is basically going beyond machine learning to bring cognitive based reasoning, so that I'm able to make sense not only of what machine learning offers, but also additionally what the domain knowledge can offer. Okay? So that's where the power comes from. I hope I have answered your question. Yeah, Dr. Vinod Kumar, have I answered your question?
Yes, sir. Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Are there any other questions?
Just one more, sir. Just I want to interrupt. My question was, I will pose a question to the students. Why you want to use the neural network means when I want some fast to reduce the computational time and all that. Then fast and accurate, I can go for the neural network. As a controller, as a fuzzy logic, to adaptive controllers, some problem is there with respect to PID controllers, linear controllers. Adaptiveness is not there. Therefore, adaptive control. Therefore, machine learning is also doing same thing as that of the neural network training. From the training set, I can get the model, if a linear regression or non-linear regression. From the model, I will from the test data, I will test. I will give the, let's say, y equal to mx plus c, m and c are determined from the data, and by giving x, I will calculate the y. Similarly, neural network also doing same thing. Like that. I got it.
No. Actually, see, you're not too incorrect in what you said, except that you have looked at it only in this limited context of linear model identification. If the behavior between the cause and effect is non-linear, a linear model will not work. You need to go for non-linear models, and neural network is the first step towards building a non-linear model. Okay, but the non-linearities can be varied. There can be non-linearities because of several different You see, when you talk of linear, there is only one class, linear behavior. When you're talking of non-linear behavior, it can be a bilinearity, it could be a squared, it could be a cubic, it could be a multiplication, it could be several unknown kinds of non-linearities that can creep up, right? Now, how do you know whether a neural network can effectively represent this, or whether we need to go for different forms of learning of these non-linear relationships, cause and effect relationships? Okay, to be able to make such decisions, you need to delve into the now, we assume that we don't have first principles knowledge. You need to essentially delve into the cause and effect relationships and try to make sense of the kind of nonlinearity that could be present, and what is it that you would apply. See, you have to make sure, you have to also understand one important caveat here, that when you build models for nonlinear systems and attempt to model the nonlinearity, yes, great, you have been able to explain the forward behavior of how a cause leads to an effect. But when you want to use this model, it's usually the inverse. You want to have an desired effect and you want to find out what is the cause. So it should also be amenable to inversion. Okay, it should also be amenable to interpretability. So all of these, if you want to have when you're doing analysis, you need the power of AI tools. It just cannot stop at statistical learning and machine learning. You need to have an advanced level of reasoning, be able to interpret the data and be able to make, I would say, in other words, to guide the machine learning in a way, machine learning layer in a way that it will capture the cause and effect relationship. Okay. So you talked about, you mentioned about neurofuzzy. Now, neurofuzzy is one way of representing a neural network using the powerful concepts of fuzzy reasoning. That's a fuzzy neurofuzzy network. So many times knowledge is qualitative. How do you take qualitative knowledge and represent it to build neural networks? So TS framework, Takagi, Sugino frameworks are there. Several such reasoning algorithms need to be brought in along with neural networks to be able to represent this overall.
Thank you very much.
Professor Sharad is on the call. Maybe he can also add to this explanation. Professor Sharad, do you want to complement what I said?
Yeah, so I agree, Ravindra and Dr. Vinod Kumar. A lot of this is still evolving. So when you say machine learning, it really comes down to algorithms that can be implemented on a machine. And nowadays, the entire suite of tools which are available are part of machine learning, or as in older days, they used to call it statistical learning. And AI, as Professor Goody said, I completely agree that it is a much broader framework where a lot of these methods, for example, PCA, PLS, which people would call it as classical machine learning, but they have always been part of AI. So a lot of these things are reinterpretation. For example, if you think of a backpropagation network, it can be thought of as as a non-linear estimator with a certain basis function. So it is like with multiple layers. So some of it is reinterpretation, some of it is repackaged as a set of tools. But finally, the solution lies in whether you can solve that problem or not.
Yeah,
we will have an opportunity to talk more about
yes. I'm glad that you asked this question, Dr. Vinod Kumar. I think we will revisit this question over and over again during our course. Yeah?
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. I think Swapna has a question: how to handle non-linearities of the process in data analytics. So one straightforward answer to that question is when you have non-linearities, knowing that you have non-linearities or Gaussian characterization, whether it follows Gaussian behavior. If it does not, then you know that there is likelihood of a nonlinear behavior. Then we try to propose nonlinear models, or we propose nonlinear ways to look at the data. And here, it goes into, it can go into spaces like, higher dimension space. Basically, what in terms of support vector machines, neural networks. You are essentially trying to use nonlinear structures to capture the nonlinearities in the data. That can be an answer to the question. But the key answer lies in being able to know. See, eventually you want to keep things very simple. Okay, you don't want to have a very complex structure just because the nature of the problem is diverse. You want to keep the structure, the cause and effect modeling approach or the understanding approach as simple as possible. So if you start with linear, then you want to know whether the deviation is because of a nonlinearity. Once you know that there is a nonlinearity, sometimes there are patterns like, what I showed you in the last slides. I talked about bicoherence, bispectrum. Now, bicoherence, bispectrum show up because there is a particular kind of nonlinearity associated with control walls. And so that is a pattern that is seen on the bicoherence plot, bispectrum bicoherence plot. Okay. Likewise, if I see a different kind of a nonlinearity elsewhere, okay, then it will show up in this bicoherence bispectrum with a different pattern. So if I have an archive of representing particular types of nonlinearities with those patterns, then the next time I see that pattern in the data, I know that this is because of this kind of a nonlinearity, and I can deploy an appropriate structure in the model to capture that nonlinearity. Right. So that is also where I can build this mapping between what's seen in the analytics, the outcomes of the analytical tools like bispectrum, bicoherence, and even higher order statistics, and the type of nonlinearity. So I build this kind of a mapping between them, then I'll be able to use that mapping later on when I see different kinds of abnormalities in the data. Right? Does that answer your question, Swapna?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so I think in the interest of time, it's 7:30 now. Again, my apologies that we started late. Started at 5:45. What we can do is I will stop this recording at this point, and we can probably reassemble if you are okay. Can we go from 8 to 9:30? If anybody has a problem with that time, please post it on the chat. Otherwise, I would suggest 7:30 is the time for dinner. So maybe 8 to 9:30 is what I would suggest. Or if you want it later, also you can suggest maybe, I don't know, Professor Sharad, would you want to take the call?
Oh, I'll completely leave it to the participants. If they can come up with a consensus, that would be great. I am very